Matthew chapter 9, 18 through 26. This is God's holy, inspired, and inerrant word. While he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, If I only touch his garment, I will be well, made well. Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went through all that district. May the Lord bless the preaching of his holy and inerrant words. Have you ever stood at the end of your rope and found nothing there? Have you sat in a doctor's office and heard words that drained every certainty from the room? Have you prayed for years for a body that would not heal, for a child who would not come back to the faith, for grief that would not lift, and felt only silence pressing back? Most of us have learned to manage life. We find the right specialist, the right approach, the right words to pray. But there come moments when management is no longer an option. The ruler in Matthew chapter 9 is at that moment. His daughter is dead. So is the woman at the edge of the crowd. 12 years of suffering, 12 years of failed remedies, 12 years of invisible exile. Both have exhausted every human answer. Both come to Jesus anyway. We know that feeling. The older believer praying every morning over a body that will not cooperate, quietly wondering whether God is listening. The parent who has interceded 10,000 times for a child who still refuses to come home. The widow moving through Sundays with an ache no conversation reaches. We wonder in the quiet whether the unanswered prayer says something about the thinness of our belief, the distance of our God. Matthew 9 places two desperate people in front of Jesus. A man of standing and influence, now on his knees. A woman who has not been welcomed by a single touch in 12 years. And Matthew arranged chapters 9, 8, and 9 deliberately, miracle after miracle, pressing toward one defining question. Over what does Jesus have authority? And this passage gives the answer that silences all others. He has authority over incurable disease and over death itself. And here is the gospel reality before us. when desperate faith reaches for Jesus, he gives himself, and he always gives more than we asked for. The text will take us in 3 steps this morning. We begin by meeting 2 people at the absolute limit of human help. Then we watch what Jesus gave them, always more than they came for. And we end by pressing that truth into the places where your door feels permanently shut. Look at verse 18. While Jesus was still speaking at the dinner table, a ruler came in and knelt before him. He arrived with a request no reasonable person would dare make. My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. Jairus is requesting resurrection, authority over a body that has already stopped. Mark and Luke trace the fuller timeline. The daughter was still dying when Jesus first arrived, and messengers caught him on the road with the news of her death. And Matthew compresses all of that and begins at the end. He is asking Jesus to reverse a death. That took remarkable confidence. The centurion in chapter 8 came with precise theology, trusting a spoken word from a distance. Matthew 8 through 10. Now Jairus arrives as something even more staggering in its object, though imperfect in its form. He asks for a physical touch when, as the centurion showed, a word would have been sufficient. But Jesus does not grade the form. Verse 19 is brief and full of grace. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. Jesus gets up, he leaves the table, he follows, no rebuke, no conditions, just movement toward the place of death. Now look at verses 20 and 21. On the way to the ruler's house, the journey is interrupted. A woman pushes through the crowd from behind. She has suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years. The Mosaic law specified that a woman with this condition was ceremonially unclean. Leviticus 15:25 through 33. Anyone she touched became unclean. She could not enter the synagogue. She could not sit among worshipers. She has lived at the margins for over a decade, spent financially, spent physically, and cut off from the community of God's people. But she carries genuine faith, however imperfectly formed. She says to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. Her faith carries a kind of magical idea mixed into it. She thinks the power lives in the fabric itself. She is quiet and hidden in her approach, trying to take a healing and disappear before anyone else notices. Her theology is imperfect, and her confidence rests entirely on this, that Jesus alone holds what 12 years of physicians could not provide. Neither she nor Jairus deserves a banner of theological excellence. The ruler belongs to a religious establishment that largely resisted Jesus. The woman approaches with something close to a superstitious understanding of how Jesus works. And yet, both came to him with empty hands and no remaining options. That alone was enough. Now watch what Jesus gave them. And notice how much more it is that they requested. Jesus arrives at the ruler's house in verse 23. What he finds is the standard machinery of grief. Flute players producing mourning. A wailing crowd packed into every corner of the house. Even the poorest family in ancient Israel was expected to hire mourners. And they do this in Vietnamese culture as well. When someone died, they hire mourners to cry and make it worse than it is. And this ruler was a man of standing. Every bit of that noise rested on a single assumption. Death is the final word. Jesus speaks into it. Verse 24, go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And what was their response? They laughed at him. A crowd laughs only at a claim that contradicts what everyone present already knows to be true. The laughter tells you everything. The death was certain. And Jesus' words sounded absurd. What he is doing in verse 24 has nothing to do with correcting a medical report. He is redefining what death means when he is present. Brothers and sisters and friends, death without Christ is final. Yes, death without Christ that's it. Final. Death in the presence of the Lord of life is sleep. Sleep, come on. Temporary with a guarantee waking. Paul uses this language in two of his letters. In 1 Corinthians 15, he calls dead believers those who have fallen asleep. Their death, a pause before waking, not a permanent ending. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he tells grieving believers the dead in Christ will rise. So do not sorrow as those without hope. Sleep is the word resurrection uses for death when it knows how the story ends. The girl has died, but her death is not the end. It's nothing worse than a night's rest, because Jesus is about to command her to wake up. Verse 25 records the miracle with stunning brevity. The crowd was put outside. Jesus went in. He took her by the hand, and the girl arose. No elaborate ritual, no exorcism, no prayer offered first. In the way Elijah stretched himself over the widow's son in 1 Kings 17:21, or Elisha prayed over the Shunammite's child, 2 Kings 4:33. Though prophets interceded with God to act, and here Jesus simply acts. He touches the dead child with his own authority, and what happened? She gets up. Back in verse 22, something equally significant has happened. Jesus turns. He sees her. He calls her daughter. He says, "Take heart, daughter. Your faith has made you well." And instantly she was made well. She came for a physical cure and tried to leave without anyone knowing. But Jesus would not allow it. He turned, searched for her in the crowd, and named her publicly, daughter. Think about that. Think about what that word meant to someone who had been untouchable for 12 years. It's a belonging term. In calling her daughter, Jesus gave her back her place among the people of God. He restored her name and returned her to the community that had been close to her for a decade. She came for healing and received herself back. Jairus came for his daughter's life. Jesus gave it, and then the news spread through the entire district. He came alone at the cost of his reputation. He received more than a daughter. He received a testimony that traveled further than anything he had requested. Now, some had read verse 22 as a simple equation. Strong faith produces healing. Strong faith produces healing. But notice, her faith was visibly imperfect. Almost a magical idea about holiness stored in the garment, in cloth. She was quiet and hidden. Her theology was confused. And yet, Jesus commanded her faith. What he honored was the reach itself, a trust aimed at Christ alone, carrying 12 years of desperation with it. The centurion came with refined theology. Jairus came with something more hesitant. This woman came with superstition wrapped around a genuine reach. Jesus looked at all three and responded to each one. And what they shared was a single object. What they received was Christ Himself. Think of a small child who cannot yet say a parent's name correctly. She still reaches for that parent when she is frightened. The parent responds to the reaching, not to the accuracy of her words. Her reach in desperation was real. Her object was right. Faith lays hold of a God who acts by grace alone. He responds to the reaching because He is merciful. Many approach this passage looking for a moral to imitate. They say, be bold like Jairus, be persistent like the woman. Well, and there is something right in that. Coming to Christ is always right. But when their example becomes the sermon center, the focus shifts from Christ's work to human performance. Those whose prayers went unanswered carry a sense of spiritual inferiority. Those whose prayers were answered feel spiritually superiority. Both produce exactly the wrong fruit. The first brings quiet despair. The second brings quiet pride. Gospel narratives in Matthew reveal who Christ is. Jairus and the bleeding woman are mirrors of the human condition before God. Desperate, at the end of resources, with no merit to offer. And who's the hero in the story? Not Jairus, not the woman. The hero in the story is Jesus. Find yourself in these needy petitioners as honest pictures of what every one of us brings to Christ by His grace. What we have seen in this text, the imperfect faith, the excess of what Jesus gave, the quiet miracle, the name bestowed on an outcast. is the whole gospel in miniature. It's still and forever true. When desperate faith reaches for Jesus, He gives Himself, and He always gives more than we asked for. Now let's bring this truth home for you. Consider the person who has lived with a chronic condition for years. Perhaps it's pain that wakes you in the night, a diagnosis that does not resolve, fatigue that will not lift. You have sought treatment, you have prayed, the condition remains. And somewhere beneath the fatigue of the illness, there is a quieter and more painful question. If God truly loves me, would this still be here? You have adopted, without quite intending to, the belief that healing is the evidence of love, and the absence of healing is the evidence of distance. However, the text shows Jesus turning toward the woman, seeing her and calling her daughter. His love was visible before the physical cure was confirmed. In the turning, the seeing, the naming, Jesus may grant physical healing. And we should ask for that, as this woman did. Jesus may also give what Paul received, sufficient grace to endure, a presence that holds the person who carries the condition. In either case, what Jesus gives is Himself. Your chronic condition falls within the gaze of the same Jesus who turned and found the trembling woman in the crowd. This week, when pain is still present in your body, your mind, your brain, and you begin to wonder whether God is listening, stop and pray. Lord, I am the person in the crowd. You turned and saw her. Please turn and see me. Name yourself in the story. Let the text become your prayer. Think about the believer whose faith has grown thin from years of unanswered prayer. You have prayed faithfully for a child who walked away from everything you taught him. The prayers have grown hollow. You find yourself wondering whether God is actually engaged with your situation. Jairus came to Jesus when his daughter was already past all medical possibility, past the reasonable window for hope. But he came anyway. Christ responds because He is sovereign. The consistency of your prayer plays no part in that decision. Bring your death situation to Him. He is Lord over death itself. So this week, write your child's name on a piece of paper. Put it somewhere you see it every morning. And when you see it, do not evaluate your prayer record. Oh, I have prayed for so much. No, just bring the name to the Lord. The way Jairus brought his daughter's name. You are presenting your death situation to the one who raises the dead. And consider the widow who moves through the week with a loneliness that no program quite fills. You lost the person who carried the most vulnerable part of your life. You wonder sometimes whether there is anything on the other side of death, or whether the quiet of the grave simply ends everything. Yes, death hurts. It hurts a lot. Jesus does not dismiss grief. What he redefines is death's finality. For the one who belongs to Christ, death is sleep, temporary, with a guaranteed waking. The girl rose when Christ took her by the hand. And the same Jesus who took that dead girl's hand will also take your hand when the time comes. He has authority over that door. Brothers, sisters, and friends, two desperate people are in front of us this morning. A powerful man brought low by grief, an invisible woman brought forward by 12 years of empty-handed need. Neither came with anything to offer except need. Both came because they had nowhere else to go. The woman came for a cure and received a name, daughter. A ruler came for his daughter's life and received a public miracle that spread through the entire district. Jesus gives himself, and when he gives himself, he gives everything. So every time we gather on the Lord's Day, we are standing on the far side of what this passage is pointing forward. The one who took the dead girl by the hand has himself entered death, the death that carries the weight of the world's sin, the curse that falls on every human being and that none of us could bear alone. Jesus entered it and came through it. His was a different kind of rising. The girl in Matthew 9 would one day die again. Jesus rose to a life that death cannot touch a second time, securing resurrection for all who belong to him. The miracle of Matthew 9 is a preview. The cross and the empty tomb are the full disclosure. The same authority that silenced the mourners, the laughters, is the authority that broke death permanently when Christ walked out of the grave. The noise of the crowd, the laughter of the mockers, the certainty that death has the last word, all of it was silenced by a single touch. He took her by the hand, and she arose. That is the testimony of this text. And it is the testimony of the entire gospel. Christ has authority over every door that seemed permanently shut. So this remains forever true. When desperate faith reaches for Jesus, he gives himself, and he always gives more than we asked for. Amen.